Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm looking at the Asus ROG Swift PG27UCWM, the first 27-inch 4K WOLED gaming monitor and the little brother of the 32-inch PG32UCWM that I reviewed not too long ago. Now, you might have noticed that this review isn't nearly as long as the PG32UCWM review, and that's for one simple reason. The 27-inch version is very similar to the 32-inch version. In fact, in most areas, it offers identical performance. So rather than repeating myself a ton, I'm going to quickly go over the similarities, discuss the differences between the 27 and 32-inch models, and then provide a full conclusion. The main interesting aspect here is how the PG27UCWM compares to other 27-inch 4K OLEDs, because this segment of the market is very different to what we see with 32-inch models. So the PG27UCWM is a 27-inch 4K 240Hz gaming monitor using a brand new tandem WOLED panel from LG Display. Unlike in the 32-inch category, this is LG Display's first 27-inch 4K OLED panel, and they're jumping into things by offering an RGB Stripe subpixel layout and the latest emissive layer technology. It's exactly the same tech as seen in the 32-inch RGB Stripe panel, but with each pixel shrunk down to meet the higher density requirements of 27-inch 4K. The PG27UCWM has exactly the same feature set as the PG32UCWM, 240Hz refresh rate with adaptive sync, a 1080p 480Hz dual mode, DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR20 connectivity, Dolby Vision support, and Display HDR True Black 400 certification. It also uses essentially the same design, just reduced in size relative to the 32-inch model, with the same glossy coating branded as True Black Glossy. I'd highly recommend watching the full PG32UCWM review to get a sense of how this monitor performs and the features it offers, because practically everything is the same. For example, motion performance is identical because both monitors offer the same 4K 240 and 1080p 480Hz modes, dual mode works identically, and all the OSD settings are the same. Some aspects to the PG27UCWM are the same as the PG32UCWM, but because it competes against a different set of 27-inch 4K OLED panels, there's some different conclusions to draw. One area is the glossy coating. Again, this is visually identical to the 32-inch model, but the 32-inch variant competes with the latest 2026 QD-OLED panels from Samsung Display, which have introduced a new film designed to reduce ambient light reflectance and raised blacks. This makes QD-OLED more competitive with glossy WOLED in black levels in the 32-inch category. In the 27-inch category though, Samsung Display have not updated their 4K panel offering compared to the original model released at the start of 2025. There's no film to reduce ambient light reflectance, so the 27-inch 4K QD-OLED panel looks most similar to the original 2024 32-inch 4K QD-OLED. This gives glossy WOLED a larger advantage in terms of black levels in brighter ambient environments relative to the best QD-OLED screens, though the mirror reflectivity battle is similar, with QD-OLED better able to combat direct reflections. There's also the interesting inclusion of an RGB Stripe subpixel layout on a 27-inch 4K panel for the first time. LG Display never made a 27-inch 4K panel using older layouts like RGB, so this is their debut offering, and it makes the main competition QD-OLED's Triangle RGB. RGB Stripe is a superior layout for text rendering, as it's more compatible with subpixel font rendering and other subpixel level techniques that rely on a known RGB layout. However, the differences between RGB Stripe WOLED, Triangle RGB QD-OLED, and the RGB Stripe on LCDs is even less significant at a 27-inch panel size compared to 32-inch. At 32 inches, I felt the RGB Stripe made a small difference relative to QD-OLED Triangle RGB, but potentially a difference a lot of people won't notice due to the relatively high 140 ppi pixel density of those panels. Well, the 27-inch panel is even more dense, 166 ppi, and this further reduces any differences in text quality stemming from the subpixel layout. Realistically, whether a 27-inch 4K panel uses RGB Stripe or Triangle RGB, it doesn't make much difference to overall image quality. I already felt that Triangle RGB at this density looked effectively identical to RGB Stripe LCDs, and I feel the same about the RGB Stripe WOLED. It's neat that LG Display are using this layout, I guess, and maybe the removal of the white subpixel was required to hit this density, but I don't think it's much of a difference maker. Text clarity is great on all of these 4K options. HDR Performance is essentially identical to the PG32UCWM, so please check out the full 32-inch review to get my thoughts on how the HDR modes are configured, general accuracy, and also how Dolby Vision works. If you were a little disappointed with the modes on offer, especially the lack of a standard peak mode with strong accuracy and dark content, you'll also be disappointed with the PG27UCWM as it's configured in the same way. Both sizes offer similar calibration in their HDR modes. My 27-inch unit was slightly more accurate in the console HDR mode and slightly less accurate in the display HDR mode. Both models offer the same color brightness and HDR color volume, with the 27-inch unit having slightly lower Rec 2020 color space coverage. I only saw minor differences in HDR brightness. My 32-inch unit was a bit on the low side in terms of 100% white brightness at 230 nits, whereas the 27-inch model achieves 250 nits here, which is 9% higher. The PG27UCWM also pushed slightly higher in peak brightness, up to 1051 nits versus 985 nits, which is 7% higher, but for middle window sizes, both models offered the same performance. In real scene brightness, both models delivered the same average performance in the true black configuration. In the console HDR mode with brightness increased to 100, the PG27UCWM ended up with a geomean of 445 nits, which was 4% higher than the 32-inch model, a rather negligible amount, and I suspect over a broad sample of both models, you'd find they perform about the same on average. What's more interesting is looking at the comparison between the 27-inch WOLED and 27-inch QD-OLEDs. In the true black configuration, the PG27UCWM delivers very similar performance to the PG27UCDM, so in that lower brightness mode, you'll achieve the same sort of image quality. In the high brightness modes, there can be a small difference though, depending on the model we compare it to. The 27UCWM was brighter than the AW2725Q that uses a 27-inch 4K QD-OLED, but not as bright as either the PG27UCDM, XG27UCDMG, or the 272URX. Because the 27-inch WOLED model is slightly brighter than the 32-inch, there's a smaller gap between WOLED and 2025 QD-OLED. The other thing that favors the WOLED panel here is a lack of competition from newer QD-OLED panels that reach the True Black 500 tier. In the 32-inch category, you have monitors like the PG32UCDM3 that in our testing average 520 nits, 17% brighter than the 27UCWM. But you don't see similar performance from 27-inch 4K QD-OLEDs. At this size, the only True Black 500 options are 500Hz 1440p models like the 272QPX50. What this means is that overall, the lower brightness output of the PG27UCWM is more competitive within its segment than you see in the 32-inch category. A similar thing happens in SDR brightness. The 27UCWM offers the same 260 nit output in full white SDR as the 32UCWM, but this ends up being more competitive with QD-OLEDs because the current crop of 27-inch variants top out at just over 250 nits. There are no 27-inch 4K QD-OLEDs that reach 300 nits, so if you go WOLED or QD-OLED here, you end up with the same sort of output. If you are wondering about SDR accuracy, my 27-inch model was more accurate in the sRGB mode than the 32-inch out of the box, with excellent Delta E performance across grayscale and color checker tests. This makes the monitor extremely competitive with the best QD-OLEDs and a top-tier product that requires few, if any, tweaks out of the box. Oh, and the issue where auto color management doesn't work is found on both the 32 and 27-inch models, though the sRGB mode is fully customizable and unlocked. Looking at uniformity results, the 27-inch model had slightly better uniformity across both whites and greys compared to the 32-inch, not as much of a fall off along the edges as the larger 32-inch panel, and the dirty screen effect was even harder to see. Dark grey banding is minimal and shouldn't be a noticeable issue during everyday use. It's nowhere near the level of the 27-inch tandem WOLED panels. The final aspect to explore is power consumption. The 32-inch model isn't too far off the latest 32-inch QD-OLEDs from Samsung Display. However, the 27-inch panel appears to be less comparatively efficient. Displaying 200 nits of full white, the 27UCWM clocked in at 86 watts, compared to around 74 watts for a typical 2025 4K QD-OLED. That's 16% higher power consumption to show the exact same thing, and over double the power usage of a 27-inch IPS LCD. In our mid-APL gaming test, I was surprised to see the 27-inch model only using slightly less power than the 32-inch model, again suggesting the 27-inch variant is a bit less efficient in its operation. While the 32-inch model is similar to a QD-OLED in power, the 27-inch model uses about 19% more power than a typical 27-inch QD-OLED. I don't think this makes all that much difference to how enjoyable the monitor is to use, it's just an interesting observation. Everything else is pretty much the same, so if you're interested in a much more comprehensive breakdown, I'd highly recommend checking out my PG32UCWM review, which explores how this display family performs in general. Sometimes we see large differences in performance between two similar sounding panels of different sizes, but not in this case. Even the feature set Asus offers is the same. And this brings me to my final thoughts on the Asus ROG Swift PG27UCWM. While there are some performance frustrations with this new RGB Stripe WOLED panel family that I detailed in my PG32UCWM review, I ultimately think it's a good thing that both the 27 and 32-inch models deliver essentially the same performance. You don't have to worry about one model being downgraded relative to the other. If you're interested in this type of panel, you can choose your preferred size and enjoy the same experience either way. In some ways, the advantages of the RGB Stripe format are less significant in a 27-inch panel size. As it's a higher pixel density to begin with, the Subpixel layout is less influential on text quality, so there isn't much of a difference between this WOLED and previous QD-OLEDs. I think the RGB Stripe will be great once it comes to 1440p panels at this size, but at 4K, it's not that significant. In other ways, this new panel is more competitive than the 32-inch version, as there's less competition in the 27-inch size. When you look at the 32-inch options, there's two QD-OLEDs, the original one from 2024 and an updated one from earlier this year, plus several other WOLED options, including the original models, and then there's newer tandem WOLEDs with the white subpixel. At 27 inches, there's just the 2025 QD-OLED panel and this brand new RGB Stripe WOLED. That's it. This means that some of the criticisms I had with the 32-inch version don't really apply to the 27-inch model. For example, I wasn't thrilled with the brightness regression compared to WOLEDs that use the RGB subpixel layout. Well, at 27 inches, there is no RGB alternative. I also wasn't thrilled with lower overall brightness compared to the very latest True Black 500 class QD-OLEDs. Again, at 27 inches, there's only one QD-OLED competitor, it's True Black 400 class, and it offers similar brightness characteristics to this RGB Stripe WOLED. With less panel competition, it's easier for the new WOLED option to offer the better overall package. Brightness and color performance is similar to the QD-OLEDs, panel dimming appears to be an issue with both display types, overall feature sets are similar, especially if we compare the Asus PG27UCWM to the PG27UCDM. But the WOLED has several advantages up its sleeve. It has a better screen coating that preserves deeper blacks in a wider range of ambient light conditions. It offers a 1080p 480Hz dual mode useful for improving clarity and reducing input lag in competitive games, something that current QD-OLEDs don't offer at all. And if you really do want the closest to LCD-like experience, this WOLED offers a true RGB stripe instead of triangle RGB. Those advantages, I think, put the 27-inch WOLED panel ahead of the QD-OLED panel. The QD-OLED does have some unique strengths of its own, including reduced mirror reflections, better grey uniformity, and slightly higher color volume. But if I had the choice between the PG27UCWM and a 27-inch 4K 240Hz QD-OLED at the same price, I'd personally pick the PG27UCWM. Although those HDR configurations are a bit disappointing, and I hope Asus add in a peak type mode through a firmware update. The problem that Asus face is that the PG27UCWM is not the same price as a typical 27-inch QD-OLED. In fact, it's not even close. This new RGB Stripe WOLED is entering the market at $1,200 US, which is absurdly expensive. I know this is the same launch price as the PG27UCDM QD-OLED from 2025, but in the current market, the middle of 2026, it makes absolutely no sense. Based on the price data we've been collecting on monitor.deals, which you can check out for yourself right now, links are in the description, there are several 27-inch 4K 240Hz QD-OLEDs priced at just $650 US. There's the MO27U2 from Gigabyte, which I reviewed last year, the MSI MAG272 UPX24, and I've seen the Dell AW2725Q down there as well. Okay, yeah, sure, the PG27UCDM is currently $1,000 and has never dropped below $900, but I wouldn't recommend the flagship Asus QD-OLED at that price right now. You can clearly see the issue here. QD-OLEDs start at $650 US, $700 worst case, for a panel of this size and spec. The PG27UCWM is debuting at $1,200 US. That's almost twice the price. In no way is the better screen coating and dual mode functionality worth $550 extra, even when factoring in some of the extra features Asus offer. I'd say this is one of the most overpriced monitors I've reviewed in some time. It's more expensive than Dell's 39-inch 5K 2K ultrawide using RGB Stripe WOLED technology. Do not buy this product at $1,200 US. I think a small premium over a QD-OLED is justified here. Maybe $800 would make sense, something around that mark. It's a cool product, there's some interesting things about how it works, but we're just not in a market where all OLEDs are over $1,000 anymore. This panel type is getting cheaper and cheaper, and with the PG27UCWM, Asus are not keeping up with the pack. So anyway, that's it for this review. If you do want to support our independent testing here at Monitors Unboxed, please consider supporting us via our Patreon page. Links to do that is in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to things like the calibrated settings that we create for all of these reviews. We've also got our Discord community, great place to chat about monitors and so on. Also, feel free to use the links down below if you want to purchase this monitor or check pricing. Monitor.deals is a great place if you want to sign up. Well, you don't actually have to sign up. You just go to the website. We'll show you some deals. It's curated by me, so I'm always looking at pricing and sort of going, that's a good deal. We'll show it on Monitor.deals. So that's pretty much it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.